Hello, dear friends. Now, I would like to talk in English. The agenda of the present day situation in Ukraine is coming slowly but steadily to women's hands. And I would like to give you some example of this female decision of the conflict that is going on in Ukraine. Um, quite recently in Germany, in Köln, there was a discussion between two wonderful females who are standing firmly for the human rights. Human rights. One of them is from Russia, Catherine Schulman, and another one is Angelika Nasberger. They argued that the special military operation in Ukraine would accelerate Russia's transition from Putin's authoritarianism to the totalitarianism of the times of Ivan the Terrible. And Russia will not establish a civil society under the regime of Putin the Terrible II, or Putin the Terrible the Second, if any. Angelika, in 10 theses, listed the Kremlin's pitfalls and threats to civil society in Russia. They have become far more dangerous under the special military operation. According to Professor Nussberger, the third sector of NGOs and non-commercial organizations, NCOs, was destroyed under Putin. Everything that has been accumulated in it since the 1970s up to the 2010s was destroyed, along with the legal system for the protection of human rights. But that dispute made no mention of the military, crushed by corruption and discredited by failures in local wars outside and inside Russia. The military didn't stand up with the civil society for human rights protection, as the professional military has been pushed aside from the civil society by the so-called three-heads dragon, with resources from the Federal Special Bureau, FSB, and SVR, Outer Reconnaissance of Russia, and the Investigative Committee. Well, let's unite them in the so-called Siloviki. Angelika convincingly and vividly showed the replacement of the reborn horizontal democracy of the 1990s by the vertical autocracy of the 2010s. The latter accelerated its development in the 2020s with repressions according to law. The domestic opposition was at first isolated by the Kremlin by by quarantine laws with Chinese virus 19. Then, secondly, by arresting its leaders as foreign agents for allegedly external sources of funding. And at last, but not at least, in 2022, from December the 1st, the opposition in NGOs and NCOs, as well as ordinary citizens, are to face criminal prosecution for violation of the laws justifying the special military operation. From Angelika's speech, it follows that the Kremlin's repressions are directed against civil society for allegedly the first distorting the history of Russia that allows the occupation of Ukraine as a failed state. Just imagine, all 150 plus UN countries recognize Ukraine, but the Kremlin and 5 or 6 of its vassals do not. The second point, disclosure of military and state secrets with objective criticism of the means and methods of conducting the special military operation against Ukraine and neighboring countries will be punished by courts. The third, so-called spoiling mobilization for the special military organization, which is presented as terrorism. It's also the pretext for arrests and imprisonment. Therefore, the principles of no negotiations with terrorists deprives the opposition of the elementary right to a just trial in the court. The fourth pretext for arrests and repressions for the criticism to the special military organization operation, the reluctance of citizens to participate in the SMO can be considered as an insult, just as an insult to religious feelings, family, etc. values. The fifth point, citizens are faced with a dilemma: to go to the moral and political ghetto, wittily designed by the Kremlin, or to a prison from where, as part of a private military companies, you can get free as cannon fodder to participate in the special military operation in Ukraine. Then the practice of extrajudicial killings and repressions by law turned Russia into a state without rights for citizens. According to Professor Nussberger, legal, political, and historical cynicism of the Kremlin with the rights of ancient Russia, like in the time of Ivan the Terrible, has become trademarks of the Russian Federation under Putin. This definition puts Russia outside the norms of international law and even above the latest assessment by the Council of Europe, like a state sponsor of terrorism. As a result of the transition of power in the Russian Federation from authoritarianism to totalitarianism, public opinion and political elites of the United Europe have become deaf to the bell of the opposition inside and outside Russia. Therefore, the real support of more than 1 million citizens who have fled the Russian Federation with her repressions during the SMO in Ukraine is zero. The support is zero, as Professor Nussberger claims. And her last but not least thesis, such a reaction of the political elites and public opinion of the EU countries categorically doesn't suit Angelica. She disagrees with such a position of the EU countries and their elites, as well as the destruction of the structure for the protection of human rights that has been developed in the 1970 up to 2010s in Russia and under the recent special military operation. Angelica delicately hints at the passivity of the liberal-minded Moses, who from abroad have been leading their people in Russia through the post-communist desert for more than 40 years. Angelica finished listening the Kremlin's threats to the civil society of Russia with the eternally so question, of the Russian intelligentsia. What to do? What's to be done? And Catherine Schulman boldly answered this question. First, in her opinion, there can be no transit to totalitarianism from authoritarianism with the evident fragmentation of civil society in Russia. Therefore, there will be no one to build and nothing to build with a temple of totalitarianism for Putin's the Terrible too, said Catherine Schulman. Moreover, now there are fewer and fewer people who want to build that temple from the inside people. And even more than 1 million young and not so young men who ran away from the country for 10 months do not want to build the temple of the special military operation victory. There'll be no victory, of course. And bearing in mind tens of millions of those who went into eternal emigration, they also disagree with such a perspective to maintain such a temple. Catherine Schulman supported Angelica's thesis that NGOs could help the poor and humiliated by the authorities, as in the 1990s. But NGOs under Putin have turned into fake NGOs on payment from the state treasury. And therefore, among them, there is less and less enthusiasm to be mobilized for the occupation of Ukraine. This is reflected in the meager assistance from them to the cripples and who return from the SMO and the families of the dead. Those functions of the NGOs were taken over by the local and federal bureaucracies at huge cost and with great values. Among the 300,000 mobilized military and volunteers in the SMO, there is less and less desire to climb on the armor of a tank for the occupation of Ukraine and neighboring Baltic states. And this is what the Kremlin media, mass media, is willing to say to citizens. And the state media resources are increasingly glorifying the lumpen militaria with the shameful experience of punitive wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, etc. The representative of such lumpen militaria, a retired General Andrew Grulov on the marginal TV channel Tsargrad on November 25th, predicted the defeat of Ukraine even without striking it with the Kremlin's strategic nuclear triad. The general said that according to the military doctrine of the Russian Federation, this triad should be applied against the friends of Ukraine. And then those friends should persuade Kiev to surrender to the rule of Putin the Terrible too. Catherine Schulman, even before the statement of that general, proposed to replace the usual strong male hand in Russia with a female foolproof. I like this idea. Such foolproof is a must, and not in the paradigm of centrism with its radical authoritarian power from friends and relations, but in the paradigm of non-centrism based on local self-government and self-defense from one's own and external bureaucracy. Under the dominant model of centrism since the days of the USSR, all Russian NGOs spin like squirrels in a wheel. Therefore, alas, for more than 40 years, they do not represent any challenge either to authoritarianism or the totalitarianism that supposedly replaces it during or after the special military operation in Ukraine. Catherine Schulman also has declared only two main functions for the third sector: helping the sick and the old, as well as assisting the repressed citizens and their families. Something similar to the Salvation Army from the USA and UK, which under Putin was expelled from the Russian Federation, just to mention, for militarism in the title. In the 2010s, the regime under the golden shower of petrodollars supplanted the third sector, created with outside help, and the Kremlin imitates such a replacement by its own NGOs, public councils, and people's funds at the expense of the state treasury. By the 2020s, disunity, even among NGOs and friends loyal to the regime, looks like, according to Dr. Schulman, a plus to autocracy. It's an interesting idea. She insists that atomization of potential products of civil society is a guarantee against flash mobs, such as events in Khabarovsk city and other Russian cities. So the needs of the SMO raised before the Kremlin the question of the volume of violence inside and outside the country with the predictable reaction of civil society. Catherine Schulman sees such a change in the likely volume of violence when, first, there'll be 10 points. Just be ready. Civil society is passive in reducing the volume of violence of the Kremlin. The second, purges from elites, purges among elites increase the confidence of the masses in autocracy, and the Anti-Corruption Foundation, so-called FBK created by Navalny, looks like in a different light for the Kremlin survival. The FBK, or the Autocracy Anti-Corruption Foundation, presents an alternative to the creation of other structures of the opposition in or out of Russia. The fourth, the proposals of the State Monitoring Committee and the Investigative Committee on the openness of NGOs and fronts are a gift to the volume of violence regulated from above. It's an idea of Catherine Schulman. The depressiveness of the citizen, any citizen, is cultivated in the mass media. That nothing depends on me leads to the atomization of civil society and, paradoxically, to the lack of passion and motivation of citizens necessary for autocracy itself, and even more so for building totalitarianism structures. Today, citizens do not want to defend the Kremlin in Ukraine. Tomorrow, they will not defend the Kremlin and will fly out of the Kremlin's control, dismissing ideas of the temple building, temple of totalitarianism. The sixth point, this attitude prevents citizens from getting on tanks, as in the war in Chechnya and Syria, or throwing themselves on the tanks, as in Tiananmen Square in China. It's very similar to Trotsky's slogan in 1918, "No war, no peace with Germany." There is something similar. The seventh point of the set is the government itself doesn't create parties for the consolidated opinion of society and doesn't give a chance to create parties by others. And the conclusion is that it's quite impossible for totalitarianism to emerge from nothing. NGOs and the People's Front in Russia are kept inclusively at the expense of the state treasury. But for some reason, the FBK by Navalny investigates more often the property of oligarchs abroad than inside Russia. It's also a funny question. The Kremlin's centrism has no future because of its failed demographic policy. It's the last argument of Catherine Schulman, and I like this argument very much. Why there is no future for the Kremlin centrism? Because of the lack of support among young people. There is, however, as Dr. Schulman believes, growing trust of the Kremlin in women in their 40s and above, with their strong conformism from the 20th century. The conclusion of Dr. Schulman's speech is that Russia's autocracy has neither the means or the hopes for a transition to totalitarianism. Why so? It's very simple, because not very aged women do not like strong male hand as the core of state governing. The ensuing questions to Dr. Schulman and her answers confirm my assessment of the squirrel running in the wheels of centrism. But it still has a light at the end of the tunnel called centrism or authoritarianism. Vertical authoritarianism, let's call it in this way. The general conclusion is that the role of women over 40 years in the civil society of Russia is growing under two circumstances. Firstly, since 2019, there have been more women in protests because they are less beaten by the siloviki, by the police. And secondly, when men are mobilized for the special military operation, women are more likely to lead NGOs and other civic engagement infrastructures in society in Russia. Germany has been giving space to enterprising women since the days of Angela Merkel. I would like to paraphrase a well-known Russian proverb: what is good for a German is death for a Russian. If the Kremlin continues to act in the format of the special military operation in Ukraine. That's all, my dear friends. Well, let me know about your opinion and your criticism, if any. Bye-bye. Good luck to all of you in our struggle against authoritarianism and totalitarianism. We shall overcome.